Here we go. Here we go. Ready? Yes!
Since being added to the PlayStation ecosystem back in 2008, trophies have become integral. The concept was very similar to achievements, but instead of each accomplishment being given a score, on the PlayStation, accomplishments were tiered by bronze, silver, and gold. And when Uncharted Drake's Fortune was patched to retroactively add in trophies, anyone who was able to obtain every bronze, silver, and gold trophy associated with the game was awarded a Platinum trophy. Final Fantasy would have its first trophy-laden game in March 2009 following the Western release of an Ivalice spin-off called Crystal Defenders. But it wouldn't be until the following year that Final Fantasy fans would be given the opportunity to test their skills with a Platinum trophy. That Platinum came via the release of Final Fantasy XIII, and its trophy list offered up a stern test for fans. In the years that followed, every new Final Fantasy release would feature trophies, and as the older games were re-released, trophies would be retroactively added into the experience. As of 2023, it means there are now a considerable number of Platinum trophies that can be obtained, but some are much harder than others. Today, we're going to take you through some of the hardest, and we're going to kick things off with the game that started it all, Final Fantasy XIII. Even though trophies had never been a thing before the release of Final Fantasy XIII, there had always been plenty of challenges. Final Fantasy XII even attempted to codify these through the Sky Pirate's Den, but it wouldn't be until Final Fantasy XIII that the first official Platinum trophy would exist. The acquisition of this trophy became a hot topic. For many years, there had been hardcore Final Fantasy fans wanting to show their commitment to the franchise in a way that could be shared. This provided that opportunity. But what many didn't expect was how difficult and how much of a time commitment would be required to obtain that Platinum. In total, there will be 35 trophies required for the Platinum. Many could be obtained through natural progression, but there were some that required specific focus. Let's see, PARAGON, for example, would require the player to not just defeat every single sea stone found throughout Grand Pulse. Instead, it would require them to defeat every mission with a 5-star rating. This would require significant planning, with the Gold Watch accessory advised, as once equipped, it would extend the target time allotted for battles, making it much easier to obtain that 5-star rating. Another troublesome trophy was Treasure Hunter. This would require the player to hold every weapon and accessory within the game at least once. And as there were 102 weapons and 119 accessories found within Final Fantasy XIII, obtaining this trophy would require a considerable amount of time and planning. Thankfully, there are now numerous guides available, but upon launch, this was a considerable undertaking. And due to the intricacies of the upgrade system and the random elements associated with acquiring items, it could have ended up taking hundreds of hours. Amongst the pantheon of available Final Fantasy Platinum trophies, Dissidia NT is one of the more recent. By this time, the developers had often opted to create much easier and obtainable trophy lists amongst their role-playing offerings. But perhaps because Dissidia NT was a fighting game, they felt the need to ramp up the difficulty. This difficulty came at players from numerous angles. Some trophies were time-related, requiring the player to win a certain amount of matches and unlock the story through repetitive play. There were other trophies such as Treasure Hunter, which required the opening of treasure, something that could also only be achieved through repetitive play. One of these trophies, called They're Free What an Offer, would end up being the rarest, as it was difficult to game. It would require the player to claim 300 pieces of treasure, and even when using methods to speed up the process, it would still take a considerable amount of time. Many of the other trophies were skill-related. Guardian of the Divine Will, for example, would require the player to beat every summon on hard difficulty. But perhaps the biggest time sink, at least when the game had an active and competitive player base, was obtaining each individual character trophy. These require players to win a ranked match with an A++ rating 3 times, with every single character in the default roster. As each character required intricate knowledge to maximize performance, and opposing players would be actively trying to undermine your efforts, obtaining just one of these was tough, but obtaining all of them? Well, that was hard as nails. Nowadays though, it's a bit easier to obtain due to there being so few players, as the AI bots just aren't anywhere near as good as real people. On the surface, Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon Everybody was a happy-go-lucky spin-off game focused on Final Fantasy mascots. But beneath its adorable visual style was a pretty harsh trophy list that was geared towards completionists. Amongst the 34 trophies were a few related to natural progression, but many of the trophies were associated with optional dungeons and obtaining items. Never-Ending Journey, for example, required players to reach floor 500 within the Insatiable Hunger dungeon, while Dungeon Master was granted once all dungeons had been completed. There were also trophies associated with obtaining and then maxing out every job, as well as combination trophies such as Right Place, Right Job, which required the player to complete a dungeon with every job, and Through Thick and Thin, which required players to complete a dungeon with every type of monster as a buddy. Beyond that, Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon also had its own Treasure Hunter trophy, a regular occurrence within Final Fantasy trophy lists. This required the collection of one of every item type. But to date, the rarest trophy, aptly named Everybody, related to befriending all possible monsters and characters in the game. It's estimated that even with proper planning, obtaining the Platinum trophy for this game can take upwards of 120 hours, so be prepared for a long slog with some challenges along the way. Final Fantasy XIV stands as one of the hardest Platinum trophies to obtain, something that is not all that surprising given its status as an MMO. But what's intriguing is that this notion has now been further compounded by there being 2 possible Platinum trophies associated with the game, and each have their own difficulty quirks. Trophies have been associated with Final Fantasy XIV ever since its release as A Realm Reborn back in 2013 on the PlayStation 3. This list, due to the nature of the game, featured numerous time-intensive trophies. Many would be associated with crafting, with there being a requirement to synthesize 1,000 items as well as performing certain actions 1,000 times, such as fishing. The challenge was that these were not one and done. There was a trophy associated with every craft and every action type. Beyond that, the player would also need to perform plenty of combat-related challenges, such as defeating 10,000 enemies, completing 1,000 fates, and clearing 100 instanced raids. Many years later, to coincide with the release of the PlayStation 5 version of Final Fantasy XIV, a brand new trophy list was created. It would not replace the original version, instead coexisting. And even though there were some shared elements, this new trophy list was much harder. It would still require the completion of fates and dungeon raids or trials, but the volume was increased, with a new trophy added for the completion of 3,000 fates and 2,000 instance dungeon raids or trials. Synthesis and gathering also returned, but it was condensed, however, to a cumulative total, with 5,000 collectibles needing to be synthesized and 8,000 collectibles needing to be gathered. Perhaps the biggest difference between the two was the addition of tough challenges. To obtain the Platinum trophy on the PlayStation 5 list, players would need to complete the second coil of Bahamut Savage, and when combined with the other trophies, it meant this new list would provide a stern test in terms of both difficulty and time commitment. Next, we have Final Fantasy X-2. As the original game was released on the PlayStation 2, there were no trophies. But for the HD remaster, the developers racked their brains to try and figure out what milestone events and challenges would make sense to include. Perhaps the most obvious, outside of standard progression, was that players would need to obtain 100% completion. This was something that caused numerous problems back when the original game was released, and can still cause problems today without a strong guide. Final Fantasy X-2 also featured numerous missable trophies. One example was Sphere Hunter. This required players to obtain all the dress spheres, including the mascot dress sphere, and this could only be obtained by achieving episode complete for every area in Spira. The Monster Master trophy could also be problematic. Not only was this also missable, but it would involve a significant grind, requiring the player to not only encounter every normal enemy featured in the game, but every Oversoul variant as well. Beyond that, there were also trophies that involved Via Infinito, the game's devilish optional dungeon. Deep within, players would be tasked with defeating both Tremor and Paragon, no easy task. Due to how much variety was involved, this all made obtaining the Platinum trophy for Final Fantasy X-2 a significant achievement. by 2020 there have been quite a few Final Fantasy-based trophy lists produced. Many contain trophies relating to natural progression and either maximizing out of character stats or obtaining all collectibles. Some would also feature trophies related to performance within minigames and the defeat of super bosses. And it meant the individual challenge for each game therefore related to methods of acquisition and the ease of beefing up the party to overcome odds in an effective manner. The Final Fantasy VII Remake would have many trophies of this ilk, with the pull-up challenge being a particular favourite. Some story-related trophies could also be missed, something that would require the replaying of chapters as opposed to the whole game. But where it differed in a significant way was that difficulty was now introduced into the equation, and to obtain the platinum, players would need to finish the game on hard mode. As this meant squaring off against beefed up enemies with no access to items, playing on hard mode would present quite a difficult challenge. But the real challenge would come from the tailor-made encounters found within Don Corneo's Colosseum and the Shinra Combat Simulator. Each would provide a stern test, but it would be the final challenges that would end up being a stumbling block, as they were akin to facing super bosses, but with difficulty modifiers attached. The hardest would be against Pride and Joy. But what made this quite devilish wasn't so much the encounter itself, it was more that the players would need to go through a boss gauntlet that included the horrible combination of Bahamut and Ifrit at the same time. Only then would Pride and Joy be faced. Due to all of these elements, the Final Fantasy VII Remake Platinum Trophy can be tricky for some, but compared to our last entry on this list, it's a relative walk in the park. And that's because our last entry is Final Fantasy IX. And this is a Platinum Trophy that is notorious amongst the community due to how punishing it can be. Even though Final Fantasy IX has had numerous re-releases, it wouldn't be until 2016, thanks to the Steam release, that a uniform list of accomplishments would be associated with the game. These were then carried over to the PlayStation 4 re-release that was brought to market the following year. What made this particular list quite notorious was that the developers chose to take advantage of the copious amounts of challenges that already existed within the base structure of the game. And as some of these related to speedruns and completing horrible minigames, it meant the challenge of tackling every single one would often fill people with dread. Amongst these, two trophies stood out. The first, called the Ultimate Sword, would require the player to obtain Excalibur II. This required an intimate knowledge of Final Fantasy IX, as a certain point in the game would need to be reached within a certain period of time. The second, called Hail to the King, would require the player to obtain King of Jump Rope. This required incredible mechanical skill, as the player would need to jump the rope 1,000 times consecutively, something that in the eyes of many is near impossible through legitimate means. Final Fantasy IX also featured some trophies where heavy grinding would be required. Movie Critic and It's All in the Cards serve as two examples, as they required the player to view every active time event and win 100 games of Tetramaster. But the trophy that stood out above the rest was Bloodlust, as this required the player to defeat 10,000 enemies. Fortunately, as time has passed, some of these trophies have become a bit easier to obtain. Bloodlust and the Ultimate Sword, for example, can be exploited through using high speed mode, and you can also manipulate the jump rope challenge using a remote play application. Even still, acquiring this Platinum Trophy is not for the faint of heart. But with that, we're at the end. They were 7 of the hardest Final Fantasy-based Platinum Trophies you can obtain. The real question though is, how many of these do you have? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. Also, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, as we have a load of exciting content in the pipeline, including a documentary about the original Final Fantasy that's over an hour in length, and some interesting videos about Final Fantasy XVI. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Elsa Claire Farron, Gelson Dikajata, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.